I don't know the answers, but I'm pretty sure I finally figured out what the questions are. And I can't see where we're going, but I'm pretty sure I finally figured out about where we are. So I ain't gonna worry about tomorrow, maybe Joe and maybe Sal be the one that's gonna happen either way. I can scream and holler, but I think if I can follow, you can show me where I'm going to today. Hey, hey. Hey, hey, hey. I don't know what I'm thinking, but I'm pretty sure the moments that I'm worrying are wasted time. And in my head, voices are ringing, and I'm pretty sure it's telling me to leave these cares behind. Now, so I ain't gonna worry about tomorrow, maybe Joe, maybe sorry, the one's gonna happen either way. I can scream and holler, but I think if I can follow, you can show me where I'm going to today. Yeah, yeah. Could all of this worry add one single moment to my life? ways that are still untraveled.
Many are the gifts that we share, many burdens we bear, many mysteries still unraveled.
Many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of love. Many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of love. Some will be the teachers of life, some the preachers of love, some the fathers and some the mothers. Some will be the ones who will care, some will listen and share, serving God as they serve each other. Many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of love. Many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of love. Living as the body of Christ and the heart of the earth and the hands that will break new ground.
Celebrate the gifts from within. Now it's time to begin. God's people turn this world around now.
Many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of love. Many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of love. Oh, many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of love. Yeah, yeah. God is our refuge and strength, the one on whom we depend. Though the mountains may fall to the heart of the sea, I shall not fear, for God is with me. There is a river whose streams make glad the city.
Hi, and welcome to my presentation on hope and despair for these days. It seems like since I proposed this topic, there have been a lot more things that need our hope and a lot more things that might cause us to despair. So what I'm hoping today is that we can just think together a little bit about what a more resilient hope would look like in the 21st century. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. And what I want to say first off is that in the ideal world, we would be together and we would be talking about these things and we would share our thoughts together and we would get to pause and be quiet and think about things, but these aren't the ideal days, so I'm having to show you a PowerPoint with a narration, but please feel free to stop, pause, think, start again. I asked some questions along the way that you're welcome to think through, and there are things that you can take with you. So yeah, in the ideal world, we wouldn't be doing it like this, but hopefully you'll be able to get something from it. So we're going to talk about hope and despair. And what we're going to talk about is what kind of hope we need and what hope should look like in 2020. And as I said before, it applies to all kinds of things that we have been dealing with. COVID, the environmental crisis, the election, the racism, everything that we're facing right now needs our best vision of hope. So there's a Buddhist saying that I hold on to that says, you teach what you need to learn. So as I am talking to you about hope and despair, these are the words that I really need to hold on to myself. But what I want to do is I want to leave you with a robust and nuanced understanding of hope that can survive even the hardest days and the hardest weeks. And I want to help revise despair so that it takes away that sense of personal failing. Okay, so oftentimes we feel like despair is the absence of hope and that we're personally failing God, failing each other, failing ourselves when we feel despair. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we can revision that so it feels less condemning of us. So first I want to say that a lot of what I'm going to bring to you today comes from this beautiful little book by Ellen Ott Marshall called Though the Fig Tree Does Not Bloom, Toward Responsible Theology of Christian Hope. And I highly recommend this book to you. It's wonderful. It's been reprinted by Whiffenstock in 2015. I don't know if she's updated it, but the version I have from the late 90s has just been so inspirational to me, so I recommend it to you. What I'd like to do is I'm going to start at the end. I'm going to start with the takeaways, and then I'm going to build up to how we get to those takeaways. So in the next 3 slides, there are going to be 7 ways that we're going to revision hope. And I want to leave you with these 7 ideas, but here are the first 2. First is, hope is not like a deposit that you either have or you don't have. Rather, hope is a practice, and that's going to be really important. Hope is going to be like a muscle that we can work on in bigger and smaller ways all the time. The second idea is that hope exists on a continuum. It exists from just getting out of bed in the morning to marching on the Capitol. And I'm going to argue that all the points in between just being able to get out of bed and get a shower, to marching on the Capitol with signs and millions of people, all of the points in between those two should be recognized as hope. So I want you to stop for a second and take a moment and check in with yourself. So where on this continuum do you think you are right now? Remember that wherever you are counts as a state of hopefulness. Remember that to get to this presentation, you had to get out of bed. So you've already made it past the first rung of hope. So even if you feel like you're barely making it through the day, that counts as hope. So here are 3 more. Hope is elastic. We can reevaluate objects of hope. We're going to talk about that a lot. We're going to talk about what it means to reevaluate objects of hope. So it's this constant negotiation between what is now and what is not yet. So we accept where things are and we envision something different, and we navigate the space between those 2 points. Next, objects of hope, the thing we hope for, should be challenging, right? They should be challenging to us, but not impossible, okay? I want to say something about that, right? Think about that continuum of hope. If just getting out of bed feels difficult, then marching on the Capitol might feel impossible. So at any given moment, what feels difficult and what feels impossible may change, and it should change. So if we only think about practicing hope as these giant gestures, then we set ourselves up for failure, for despair. So keep your expectations of your hopeful self challenged, but not overwhelmed. I hope that makes sense, right? So this idea that hope exists on a continuum means that there are some days when just getting out of bed feels difficult, and anything else beyond that, especially if you're doing things like homeschooling and running a church and working from home, like more than just getting out of bed and putting some sweatpants on, may really feel impossible. But on another day, maybe a pre-COVID day, we feel like we could join with other people and protest out in front of somebody's office. So what we imagine as both difficult and impossible is going to change over time. And then finally on this slide, we can hope in this life with these people. That hope is about co-laboring with God and with others in the work of hope. And that's going to be important in a minute too. And then finally, 2 more. Hope is best understood communally. We hope together. So when one of us feels hopeless, another one of us will hold hope for them and will return the favor at some point, right? Hope is best understood in relationship with other people. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not an individual endeavor. It's not something that you have to bootstrap yourself into, right? It is something that is best shared. And then finally, what if we think about despair as a moment in the ongoing life of hope? So despair isn't a failure of hope. It's just a moment in the ongoing practice of hope. So those are the takeaways. You can join me for the rest of this, or you could be happy with the first 4 slides and take away from that. But I hope that you'll join me. So take a few moments and maybe stop the presentation and think about which of these things, the things that I've just talked about, challenge you, and which of them feel liberating, which of them make you feel better about hope, and which ones do you really need to think about a little bit more. So I've listed them all here. I won't read them. We had them on the slides before. You're welcome to pause and just sort of think about which ones of these are challenging you, which ones are feeling good to you, and sort of hold on to that as we go through our conversation. So now we're going to go back to the beginning, and we're going to start with some background on theological hope. Because remember, hope is always considered a theological virtue, right? And so the person who's responsible for elucidating the most about hope as a theological virtue is Thomas Aquinas, who was born in 1224. He was a Dominican, and his major work which a lot of this is taken is called the Summa Theologica, often just abbreviated as Summa. And he said that there are theological virtues and there are moral virtues. He said the theological virtues are faith, hope, and charity, or love, which comes from 1 Corinthians 13 and was used by Thomas as a way to articulate some things that the Greek philosopher Aristotle articulated. He said the moral virtues are more like logical rules that lead to an ordered life and an ordered society. And the moral virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. So the theological virtues, he said, are gifts from God. God gives us those virtues. So this makes them seem like they're a deposit. God opens your head and pours these in, or worse, keeps them from you, right? You either have them or you don't have them. They come as a gift from God. So we're going to look at some of the ways that Thomas explains the virtue of hope and see how it might be helpful for understanding hope in the 21st century. So he offers 4 characteristics of hope. So we hope only for some good. That makes sense, right? We're hoping for something that's good, as opposed to fear, which anticipates something that's evil. So we hope for something in the future. This is different from joy, which has its object in the present. So we talked a minute ago about that negotiation between what is and what should be, and that should be is the future that we're hoping for. He says, hope is for something difficult to obtain, but not a trifle. So we have to do some work to get to hope. And we talked a little bit about the difference between difficulty and impossibility and what that actually means in real life. So in total, then, he says the object of hope is attainable, right? It has to be something we can get to. It's a future good, and it's difficult but possible. Difficult but possible. For Aquinas, there are some things that are very specific to his understanding of theological hope. And that is, first, we must only hope for what is eternal, and that's God. Okay? We can only hope in human beings to the extent that those human beings point us to God. So there's no hoping in the things of this world in and of themselves. They can only be used as hopeful objects to the extent that they point us toward God, point us toward the eternal. Another understanding of theological hope is that God acts on humans, but not with humans. So we talked about hope as a deposit. We talked about God opening up your head and depositing hope in you, or even worse, not giving you hope, right? So in this sense, God acts on humans, but not with humans. So there's no cooperation between God and humans. There's no understanding that we are actually the hands and feet of God in the world. So you can see how from that idea that God acts on humans, but not with humans, but God is understood as mostly transcendent, as far away, as the director of things, but not one with whom we cooperate. This God isn't very eminent. This God isn't very close to us. So I think that you can see some of the problems that we inherited from Aquinas' model of hope. So first of all, there's no place for God's eminence. And that means also there's no place for the good of creation. And remember, when we're talking about things that we're hoping for, Aquinas says we can only hope in that which is eternal. Well, that means that anything that's material, the things of this world, anything that is corruptible or anything that's impermanent can't be hoped in. And one of the results of that kind of idea is we can't hope in the things of this world, right? So I don't know how many of you grew up with this, but some of us grew up with the idea that the earth is not our home, that our real home is in heaven, and it doesn't really matter what we do here. Okay, it's hard to even say that out loud. What we know is that that idea has caused us to really damage the goodness of the earth, right? And so when we think about God's immanence, we think about being able to hope for and work for the things of this world, the things in creation, and not just eternal things, right? So he also said the other implication here is there's no real place for human agency in the work of God. So liberation theologians in the 70s who came out of Latin America argue that we are co-laborers with God in the work of liberation. That is, we work to aid creation, our brothers and sisters in poverty, our brothers and sisters who live in war and tragedy of any kind. We work with God to help liberate them. And then another implication, the final one, is that hope isn't a negotiation between this world and faith, but the world should be subsumed into the transcendent. And that goes back to what I said in the very first point, number A, that there's no place for God's immanence in the good of creation, right? If everything we're supposed to hope for is transcendent, then we can't negotiate between now and the next life. We can't negotiate between here and what should be, right? Everything's subsumed in the transcendent. So I think you can see that not focusing on God's closeness to us and only thinking about the transcendence, as I said, has gotten us into some trouble. And not only when we think about the environment, but also when we think about our brothers and sisters who need our assistance in this life. So we're about to be joined by my cat. I don't know if you can see her hairy body, but she's sitting on my lap while we do this, which is just another perk of working from home. You can see her tail right there. So let's ask the question, what do we need to change about this in order to face the present and the future? So what I want to talk about is this moral sense of failure that we feel when we despair. So we need to figure out how to change that. We also need to change this idea that we feel alone, or maybe just with God, in creating and sustaining hope, and especially those of us with positions of social influence. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in just a minute. We also need to change the idea that hope should look the same for every person every day. We already talked about the fact that hope exists on a continuum and that it's going to look different maybe even in the course of a day, from getting out of bed to taking a shower to doing a really good workout. There are all kinds of things that demonstrate our hopefulness and not just the grand sweeping gestures. We also need to change the idea that we shouldn't hope in other people or in things of the material world. We need to revision now. And we need to revision the idea that God only works on us and not with us. I want to go back up to the second bullet point. We feel alone in creating and sustaining hope, especially those of us with positions of social influence. Okay, right now, I'm going to talk to the pastors in the group. You know who you are. There is this overwhelming pressure to bring a hopeful word every week when you stand in the pulpit, even if you don't feel it, and even if you can't find it, and even if it's inauthentic, right? People look to you to be the face of hope. And it can feel really lonely. and it can feel really alienating, and it can sometimes feel impossible. And all of those feelings can lead to burnout. And if we were together, I think I would see some heads nodding about this. Here's what I want to say. I want to say that if we start to think about hope as existing in relationship with other people, right? Not just a deposit that God puts in our heads, but actually something, a practice that we create with other people, that we sustain with other people. That means that there are days when we can't bring that word necessarily, or we don't feel like we can authentically bring that word, but we have a community around us thinking about that, feeling about that, supporting us. So I'm going to ask in a little bit that you think a little bit about who your community is. Who's your community of hope, and how can you make it bigger, right? We all feel like we can say our spouse, maybe our best friend, but where does that need to be enlarged? Who else can help contribute to the creation and maintenance of hope? So that one, bullet point number 2, is really focused on pastors. Okay, so I'm actually working on this with a cat in my arms. So let's look at what Marshall calls responsible hope. So Marshall says, hope's not a deposit, but it's a practice. A practice that, in order to be responsible, must take into consideration the realities of life. She says we do not hope without addressing the real pain of this world. So the very first point I have here is a quote from her, that responsible hope unearths beauty and faces tragedy. It celebrates goodness and it knows cruelty. Through this kind of constant negotiation, we acknowledge both the resiliency and the fragility of human life. I just want to underscore a couple things about that. I think that we often forget exactly how resilient human beings can be. Sometimes all we feel is fragile. And she says that this negotiation between what's beautiful and what's tragic, this constant motion back and forth, is a constant negotiation that results in responsible hope, right? It's not we hope and we ignore all the things that are really difficult or all the things that are really painful. So we're just going to have pie in the sky when we die, right? That's not responsible hope. Responsible hope does not deny that things are hard, right? Responsible hope understands that in that hardness, there might be moments of beauty, moments of real, impactful, gratitude-building beauty. And it may be really small. This morning, I saw a hummingbird sit on my clothesline and look in my kitchen window at me. And it was really such a hopeful thing and so small. It did not end climate change, but it did help me keep going for the rest of my morning. So little moments of hope. Then she says, this is the second bullet point, this is not a hope that relinquishes power or agency to a unidirectional control of an omnipotent God. Rather, this hope is born when we feel empowered to act. Okay, so if hope is a practice, right, then the result of hope is that we are empowered to act in little and big ways. So the practice of hope results in our feeling empowered to act. So those are two elements of the responsible hope. She says responsible hope is both a hope in God and a hope in humanity. She says The strength and hope of humanity rests not in a transcendent vision of salvation, but in a present act of compassion. It is the power to accompany others in sorrow and anger, demanding justice and resisting destruction. Okay, there's so much to say about this, but here's what I want to say. It is not to say that God is not all-powerful, but it is to say that that power acts through us in relationships and in practices. God works through us in acts of compassion when we accompany others in sorrow and in anger, and when we work for justice, and when we resist the destruction of everything that we hold dear. All of those are acts of an all-powerful God working with us and through us in the present life. We cannot just sit back and wait for God to change things. We can't just sit back and wait for the end of our lives when we go to see God. Rather, we're called as Christians and believers and hopeful people to act in this world, right now, in this place with one another. So she says, rather than just hoping in the eternal, in God, we can and should hope in both God and humanity. So God empowers us, and we reach out to one another through that, and human beings empower us, and through that we reach up to God, right? It's not a one-way street, but it is a multi-pathed existence in which hope is created through human relationships and through relationships with God. And then finally, she says, responsible hope is communal and not individual. And this is one of the hardest things for us to accept, is that we need help having hope. And that's exactly as it should be. It is not a personal moral failure. So she says, hope is elastic. She says, practicing hope entails openness to reevaluating its objects and searching out fresh possibilities. Reevaluating the object of hope is the most difficult part because the death of a deeply held desire. I want to give you an example of renegotiating the object of hope. When I first gave this presentation and was creating this presentation for another group of people, it was January. And a dear friend of mine who had struggled mightily to have a child had finally given birth to a beautiful daughter who was about 2 years old. That friend developed stage 4 endocrineal cancer and was dying. And I was devastated. And the only thing I wanted, the only thing I hoped for was miracle. That God would save my friend so that she could bring up her beautiful daughter until an old age. That is the only thing I hoped for. And it wasn't happening. And it wasn't happening, and things were getting worse. And I had to come face to face with the fact that I could either despair and be angry at God and turn my back on that relationship, or I could figure out how I could have hope for her and hope in God without the demand that that hope look one particular way. And so I learned to hope that she could have a relatively peaceful passing. I began to pray for her that the end of her life was not painful, that she would be surrounded by her friends, that she would be conscious, that she would be able to see her daughter. And all those things happened. But it took me the longest time to give up that demand that the only thing I wanted and the only thing I would accept as hope is a miracle. is her cure from cancer. And that's what Marshall means when she says the difficult part is the death of a deeply held desire. That is the only thing I could imagine wanting in that situation. And it took me a long time to figure out that I needed to renegotiate and reevaluate the object of hope in the face of reality, right? I was negotiating what really was, which was the fact that she was getting worse, with what I hoped, which was ultimately that she live a good life as long as she could possibly live a good life. So this is what Marshall means when she says hope is elastic, right? It has much more flexibility. Excuse me. It has much more play to it than simply a deposit that's locked in your head. And she says that despair is a moment in the ongoing life of hope, and it's not the opposite of hope. Despair can last a long time, or it can last a little time. But we can have it while others hold hope for us, and while we recalibrate the object of our hope, right? So despair isn't a personal moral failing. It may simply be the sign that we need to recalibrate the object of hope. Remember, it should be difficult but not impossible. And the thing that I was holding on to for my friend who was dying was impossible. She was not going to get well. And while I held on to that, I was in despair, right? Until I could renegotiate what I hoped for, I despaired. So despair is information. Excuse me. It is a signal that there's time to renegotiate and that other people in my community are holding on to hope for me while I renegotiate. The other idea that I want to bring up here comes from the environmental writer Roger Gottlieb. And this comes from an essay he wrote in a beautiful book called Rooted and Rising, which is an edited volume that my colleague Leah Shade edited on the environmental crisis. He says, despair can be real, but not certain. Let's think about that, what that means for a second. So it can be real. I can really feel despair, but I don't know what the future is going to be, right? I don't know that the future is going to be grim. I don't know that the future is for certain going to be terrible. Despair is one of the ways that we try and project into the future when we can't deal with the uncertainty of the future. And he says that hyper-hopefulness and despair are responses that we use when we pretend like we know the future and when we want to control the future. He says, and this I find hard, some of you may too, but I'll just admit that I find it hard, despair should always be tempered with gratitude. And because he is writing about the environmental crisis, he says, what has been in your life a real moment of peace and calm in the natural world? What place in the world do you give gratitude for that has nurtured you, that has brought you up, that's been a part of who you've become? What specific natural places have made life make sense when nothing else could? So I offer up these two ideas of despair, right? Neither one of them is condemning. Neither one of them says, you're not a Christian if you don't have hope, or not a good Christian if you don't have hope. In fact, in a way, it's suggesting the opposite. It's suggesting that this hyper-hopefulness, this, despite all odds, in spite of everything I see around me, I'm going to hope for the best outcome and I'm not going to pay attention to these things that are really painful. That is actually as disillusioning ultimately as despair itself, right? We don't know the future. We can't be certain of it, either positively or negatively. So despair is a moment in the ongoing life of hope and not the opposite of hope. Okay, so finally, I want to talk about where we've come. So I know we started at the end and we worked through the beginning, but I just want to remind us of where we've come and what responsible hope for these days might look like. So first of all, hope is not static. It consists of practices that are informed by our experiences, right? What this means is I take what I experience and I bring it back in for evaluation, and I figure out how to use that experience to hope for something different, to hope for things a little bit differently. The experiences around me help me shape the object of hope. So we talked about the fact that hope is elastic and it exists on a continuum, and we can constantly reevaluate the objects of hope. That it's a constant negotiation between what is and what should be. We said that the object of hope shouldn't be trifling, it should be difficult, but it shouldn't be impossible, right? And what difficult and impossible means on any given day is up for grabs, right? So don't force yourself into impossible hope if all you have is a difficult moment of trying to get out of bed, right? If all you can do is get out of bed, then it is impossible to think about marching on the Capitol. She said, and we agreed, that hope can be in this life with these people, co-laboring with God in the work of hope. So what that means is that God works through us to establish hope in this life. We don't have to only hope for the next life. We can hope here with one another and with the planet. She said, hope is best understood communally. We hope together. When one of us feels hopeless, another will hold hope for us and will return the favor at some point. Gottlieb gave us the idea that constant despair is a certainty we don't have, that somehow shields us from the anxiety of not knowing. So despair itself is an attempt to forecast the future when we don't actually know. So it's not the failure of hope, it's just the failure to be able to accept that there's some things I don't know. I don't know how this is going to play out. I'm going to hope that things go a particular way. There may be moments of despair along the way, but I don't know for sure what the future is. So given all these things, responsible hope asks us every day to evaluate, how should I spend this minute? How should I spend this day? Where am I on the continuum of hope? And what do I need to reevaluate in order to find a place for hopefulness? What is that going to look like? So this is the end of the formal part of my presentation. I would love to be able to have a conversation with you about this, to be able to sit in small groups or in large group and talk about your feelings. But my hope for you is that you heard something or felt something along the way that you want to take with you, and that for those of you who are ministers, that maybe you won't feel so alone or so despairing when you can't find that magical word of hope on any given Sunday. Maybe it's simply giving yourself permission to just be in the pulpit that day. Thank you all so much for stopping by, and I look forward to the day when we can be together in person.